On the night of September 6 to 7, 2010, something unusual happened. What it was, and what it was about, remains a mystery to me. That night only my mother and I were at home. My brother was staying with his girlfriend. Mom was still in the kitchen, and I went to bed around 11:30 p.m., but I didn't sleep for long. At 2 a.m. I was woken up by the ringing of the house phone. Our house is noisy. The phone kept ringing, even though it was late. Surprisingly, I didn't feel like answering it. I do everything reflexively in my sleep. But what scared me the most was the caller's insistence. I woke up, hung up, and went back to sleep guiltily. 5 minutes passed, and the call rang again. It was then that I felt uncomfortable. This time my mother picked up the phone, and surprisingly, she hung up on me too, even though she had never done that before. I tried to go back to sleep, but a few minutes later, half asleep, I heard someone knocking twice, with a second pause, on the kitchen window. But it wasn't the sound of a fist or a stick. When I tried it myself, the sound was quite different, but the sound of someone hitting the glass with their whole body. In the dream, I asked my mother if she heard the same thing I did. She told me she had. Then, thinking it was someone drunk, we lived on the first floor of a regular 5-story brick house. I involuntarily went into the kitchen to check it out, but there was no one outside, and our 2 cats were spooked by something. I checked the kitchen, went out on the balcony, found nothing, and went to bed. My mom and I got scared, started reading prayers, and tried to go to sleep. We lay there and saw cats running from one corner to the other. It got scary. Mom got up to look in the direction of the pictures and started reciting prayers. At that moment, the phone rang for a 3rd time. I hung up the phone and started to turn the machine off. I was shaking with fear, and I could hardly say the words, "Our Father." I could hardly say the words, "Our Father." The clock struck 3:30. Then I knocked twice on the kitchen window, louder and more insistently than before. I was shaking with fear. Prayers were hard to come by, and the cats seemed to go mad. After a while, I ventured out onto the balcony. Of course, there was no one outside. I had no idea what it was or why it had come. It wasn't until a few hours later that my mother and I were able to go back to sleep, but I had never experienced such fear in my life. Later, a neighbor told me that our house was built on a very old cemetery, and that every 10 years people who disturb the peace come out at night to scare people. One night, I was guarding the office. My duties were minimal. Make sure no one entered. I'm a strong man. But if someone could break down a massive iron door at night, not even a policeman would stop him. So I prefer to pretend. Let the boss in, and prevent leaks from the ceiling. Sometimes the pipes on the 1st floor burst, which is minimal. 1st floor, which is minimal. In addition, once a week you have to clean the windows from the inside. All in all, it was a simple and non-dusty job. Also, there was a computer with simple games like Heroes of Sword and Sorcery, which was all I needed. I often spent Saturday and Sunday nights in that office. It was always quiet, and only the manager, a few directors, and myself had keys. One Saturday, as I was sitting in front of Heroes, there was suddenly something rustling on the other side of the door. This had only happened once before. I went over and looked through the peephole, but no one was there. I decided I'd had enough and went back to my game. But as soon as I sat down in my seat, I heard rustling again, a man's voice, which was completely unintelligible, and a knock on the door. Thinking it was the manager, I put the key in the lock. I turned the door once and looked through the peephole again, but no one was there. I said loudly, "Your first and last name, is that you?" Silence followed. This time, it was a woman's voice. She seemed to be talking, but the syllables that came out one by one were indecipherable. Then I told everyone out the door in a loud voice and threatened to call the police. I was lying here. There was no phone in the room. After about a second, I stopped hearing a woman's voice and heard a knock on the window. I opened the curtains, and was horrified. No, I wasn't just terrified. I lost my footing and sat on the floor. There was a man. I think it was a man, hanging from the iron bars. Everything about him was completely unnatural. It was as if someone who had only seen people in movies had sewn a suit that looked like a man's and put it on. I couldn't even appreciate his gender. And as soon as he saw me, he spoke, first in a female voice, then in a male voice, alternating syllables, and generally with some sort of creak and hum, as if the sounds were coming from some source. My God, his facial expressions were inhuman. 2. He moved every muscle in his face in every direction at once. While he was doing this, his arms and legs were moving across the glass and pointing upward. Perhaps he was climbing, holding an iron bar between his knees. At that moment, it seemed to me that he was flying upward. There was nothing I could do. I just sat on the floor and stared at the creature with frozen eyes. After about a minute, there was a sudden release. All the fury suddenly subsided. The creature abruptly turned around. I'm pretty sure it turned its head 100 degrees over its shoulder, froze for a few seconds and looked somewhere in the distance, then suddenly jumped down, shouted something in a low, vibrating voice, and flew away. I don't know where it went. I couldn't pick it up off the floor. I only had the strength to pull back the curtains and, stumbling, enter a room without doors or windows. The last time I cried was about 8 years ago, and when that situation passed, I started shaking. And I sat on the floor until 6 in the morning, frightened by the noise, until Artem, the shift manager, came in. I had to look at him through the peephole for 2 minutes, asking him to step back and say something. He punched me in the face, even though it was past midnight, and I just laughed out loud and responded happily. I still had tears in my eyes. When I got home, my parents couldn't understand what had happened to me. I was pale, there were dark circles under my eyes, and when they weighed me, it turned out that I had lost 7 pounds overnight. Since then, I often couldn't sleep well at night. I had nightmares. I didn't say anything or hint about it to anyone who knew me. This story happened to an excavator man who lived in a provincial town. For those who don't know what an excavator is, an excavatorist is a group of adventurous and skillful men who like to explore various underground structures. City basements have long been fertile ground for modern excavators because of their size and complexity. On this day, the protagonist, nicknamed the Mole, found himself wandering around an abandoned outbuilding in search of a gold bracelet. Rumor has it that the bracelet was carelessly dropped into the sewer by a student whose father was a big businessman. The bracelet was not found for a long time, but the young diggers did not give up. The cave turned out to be a dungeon that hid many more secrets. One day, a young excavator disappeared there. He had been warned that going underground without proper experience and a good guide was tantamount to suicide, but he listened to no one. His parents and girlfriend cried in front of the rusty door. Many years have passed since then. The Mole searched a considerable area, but found only rusty coins and trash. When he decided it was time to return to the surface, he sensed someone's presence in the tunnel. A quiet rustling sound was heard nearby. He shined a flashlight on it and looked around. Sparse mice scurried across the floor, and a strange creature appeared outside. The mouse tried to recognize the figure. Human features were visible in the blurry silhouette. The creature sat hunched over and sucked on the mouse it had caught. It began sniffing the space in front of it, as if sniffing out larger prey. The creature did not notice the light. You might have thought the creature wouldn't react, given that its long, tangled hair covered its face and head. On closer inspection, however, it appeared that the creature was completely blind. Instead of eyes, it had 2 eye sockets cut out. Digger felt an animal fear creep into his consciousness. Screaming was useless, so the Mole decided to run for his life, which seemed the only real solution. The wide tunnel soon ended, and Digger crawled down the narrow tube toward the airway, or exit, to get to the surface. The Mole had to make an effort to move his limbs, but the narrow, slippery walls made the climb slow. However, the mole does his best to move his limbs. He moves only with his senses and instincts, but he has a pretty good ability to move quickly on a slippery surface. The mole felt something grab his paw, but he felt no pain at that moment, probably for fear of being caught. He waited until Stalker's head was out of the pipe before dropping it with a heavy hatch. Once on the ground, the first thing the mole did was go to the hospital. His wounded leg was sore, and blood was flowing profusely from his torn pants. At the nurse's office, they assumed he had been bitten, as the teeth of the beast in the dugout had sunk into his bone. Upon coming to his senses, the mole decided to tell his family and friends what had happened. A violent reaction from a group of diggers followed. Soon, every agency in town was alerted, from the police to the FBI. When rescuers descended into the basement, they found the creature already dead with a fractured skull. Medical experts examined the body and came to the shocking conclusion that the creature was human. Even more surprising was the fact that the relatives of the missing excavator, who had been summoned by the police, had difficulty identifying it. Of course, most of them identified the body from the fabric, which was the clothing of an ordinary person. The search team was then forced to go underground. Investigators combed utilities, ventilation shafts, tunnels and pipes, and even discovered a mysterious underground living pit that exuded an unbearable smell and contained the mutilated remains of rats and mice, as well as small pet bones. A primal instinct, a survival instinct, overcomes the young man in a desperate situation. As an excavator operator, the young man developed his intuition and began to listen to sounds. He learned to hunt small animals underground. Most of his prey were rats, but sometimes he managed to catch a domestic animal as well. After years of suffering and poverty, the boy lost his human form and consciousness and turned into a wild and deranged underground predator. Now this wild scavenger has stumbled by chance into one of the main communication tunnels, where he has managed to meet a human being for the first time in many years. However, he only sees the stranger as his next big prey. The mole digger, who managed to escape, was very lucky. Later, the mole gave up his profession and found another, less dangerous hobby. The diggers around him stopped traveling for a while, but eventually continued their journey into the depths of the sea. This story was long passed down among the townsfolk, and various nightmare stories were added to it.